Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Avi Havivi's weekly Siddur class.
We're continuing our series. God willing, in April, we're going to hit 3 years of this particular series, which is Ideas about God through Jewish History, as this may pertain to your davening. And we've been in a long unit for many months about modern thinkers. I'm just going to briefly review. We started with Mordechai Kaplan, who is we would call him a humanist, non-supernaturalist. There's nothing out there. Anything we call God or divine is simply a projection or a label that we use for the highest moral and spiritual aspirations. Of course, if you were a more traditional person, you would say, well, what's the benchmark for what's moral, what you define as moral and spiritual, if there's no God? Okay, but that's kind of the gauntlet that Kaplan threw down. We've read, I think, 3 people, Rav Kook, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and most recently Rav Soloveitchik, all of whom I would say have a pretty traditional belief in God, so they would reject Kaplan's non-supernaturalism. They all have a pretty traditional supernatural belief in God, but they are, what makes them modern, the reason I call them modern is not just because they're in the 20th century, but because they are more human-centric. They're more concerned with the individual. They're more concerned than, in general, ancient or medieval thinkers about the individual's internal experience. Okay, they focus on that, but they are supernaturalists. Then we had a quirky guy, Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg. He was quirky in that he's a supernaturalist. He tries to square the circle by saying, in modernity, it's only because God has stepped back. Okay, God has chosen to step back. So he kind of adopts the Kabbalistic doctrine of tzimtzum, God's voluntary self-limiting, and saying that's why it appears that God is not active in contemporary times. Yes, it's true, God doesn't do miracles now the way God chose to do miracles in ancient times, but that's God's choice. So there is a supernatural realm. He has a pretty, at least in terms of what he writes, he's got a pretty traditional belief in, splitting. Let's talk about, where we are in the Torah reading cycle, splitting of the Red Sea, etc., giving of the Torah at Sinai. But he says that what marks modernity, which he calls the third age, right, of our human relationship with God, is God chooses not to do those things anymore. Okay, so that's kind of he sort of heard Kaplan. Everyone heard Kaplan, right? Everyone read Kaplan. And his reaction, he has, I get it that it looks that way, but that's simply because God has chosen to not act in contemporary times the way God used to. Okay, that's why God split the Red Sea, but didn't intervene in the Shoah. Let's put it that way. Okay, I think that pretty much covers all the people we've done in modernity so far. I might have missed one, but I think that's pretty much it. Okay. Now we're going to come to a group of 3 people. I'm going to group them together, and you might think of them. One of the editors of the first one we're going to read today would lump them together as what he calls limited theists. Theism, if you remember back to, American history, and they said, the founding fathers, they weren't theists, they were deists. Does that mean, there was a God? God was like the watchmaker. He wound up the watch, and then God, metaphorically speaking, walked away but doesn't do anything anymore. And I went back and I actually read the Wikipedia article on deism because I couldn't remember exactly what deism is. And deists believe that you can understand God through rational sources and through looking through nature, and they tended not to believe in miracles, whereas theists had a pretty traditional belief in God and God's action in the world. By the way, it's just funny, the distinction that in apparently like the 17th century, this was a label distinction, deists or theists, even though it's kind of funny because theos means God in Greek and deus means God in Latin. Okay, so technically deism and theism mean exactly the same thing, but apparently this was a philosophical thing because there was a school of deists who said, no, we're not theists, we're deists, and then other people say, accuse them, oh, deist means you don't believe in anything, and they said, no, it's not true. Okay, so there's a group of people that Rabbi Rifat Sonsino, who edits some of these books, refers to them as limited theists, and we're gonna read three of them. They are Milton Steinberg, Zal, and Harold Schulweis, Zal, and Harold Kushner, Shibadel Orech Yamim Tovim. I think Harold Kushner is still alive, not 100%. And they were all sort of followers of Kaplan. They were all conservative rabbis trained at JTS in the Kaplan era. So they were all kind of followers of Kaplan, but rejected his anti-supernaturalism. They accepted his human-centric modern view. They rejected his anti-supernaturalism, and they come up with some version of squaring the circle, which is to say, yes, there's a supernatural God, God exists, but God does not intervene currently. God doesn't do miracles nowadays. Or God is present indirectly. So we'll see Rabbi Schulweis talks about the distinction between God and godly. Well, we won't read that this week. We'll read that next week. He'll say modern people, they don't like the idea of God. They agree with godly, right? If you go work at a soup kitchen to feed the hungry, you're godly. If you ask people to vote, is that a godly thing to do? They'd say, absolutely, that is a godly thing to do. And then if you took a poll and said to them, do you believe that God feels the hungry? Then people said like, well, I don't know about that, right? So they don't believe in God, but they do believe in godly. Just like this confusion, if people have been reading the last week, Zionism, right? 70% of Americans, I can't remember, whatever the statistic was in that survey, they support the existence of the state of Israel, but they won't say but they're not Zionists. What does that mean? It just means definitions become confused. Okay? That's what it means. So you always got to say to people, define your terms, please. I'm a Zionist or I'm an anti-Zionist. You have to say, what exactly do you mean by that? So, you believe in God's presence in the world. You have to say, what do you mean by that? So these are people who believe in God's presence in the world. There is an existence of God as the supernatural, but God does not intervene. And they have various reasons for why. God chooses not to. God can't. Okay? So God is real. God exists, but God does not go poof in our world. And this makes them limited theists. Okay? Meaning they believe in a supernatural God, but they don't focus very much on the essence of that supernatural God. I guess that's kind of how they focus much more on humans. They're I don't know, humanistic you could call them humanistic theists if you want. Okay? Limited theism, another term. There's another term that I forgot. I can't. So, and they don't, I don't know that they see themselves as a school of thought. I am lumping them together. I've read selections from them and I'm saying, I think these three guys, they're definitely guys, are fairly similar. So we're going to start today with Milton Steinberg. Okay. He was the first of them. He was well-known, very prominent rabbi at Park Avenue Synagogue, sort of the flagship, mainstream conservative shul in Manhattan. He had actually had a PhD in philosophy before he became a rabbi. Had a PhD in philosophy from Columbia at the age of 25. Okay, but that was, in an era where there weren't too many jobs for Jews in universities who studied philosophy or wanted to study Judaism. So they became rabbis. In today's world, he probably never would have become a rabbi. He would have been, a college professor. And he's the one who wrote, you may have seen the book, famous book, As a Driven Leaf, which is the novelized version of rabbis of the Mishnah's time, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elisha ben Abuya, Rabbi Meir's student, Rabbi Elisha ben, Rabbi Meir's student, other way around, sorry. Rabbi Meir's teacher, Elisha ben Abuya, became a pagan apostate. He left Judaism, and he's referred to in the Talmud as Acher, the other one. He's not referred to by name, right? His name has been basically censored out of the rabbinic sources. And Milton Steinberg sort of novelized that. How many people have read As a Driven Leaf? Okay. How many people have As a Driven Leaf on their shelf but haven't read it? Okay. All right. And he was brilliant. Milton Steinberg. He had his first heart attack at age 40, and he died at age 45 or 46 in 1950. So he was sort of like a brilliant life cut short. He wrote an Intro to Judaism book. He wrote As a Driven Leaf. He had another novel which was published posthumously called The Rabbi's Wife. So what he left behind for us was limited compared to had the guy lived another 20 to 30 years. Okay? There's a Reform rabbi, I know nothing about him, named Rifat Sonsino, Sonsino, and he co-edited 2 books about various theologies of God. What we're going to be doing for these 3 thinkers is all selections from his 2 edited books. All right, this first book is called Finding God. Okay? Okay. Starting with faith. Here we are. I'm on the second page, page 100, for those who are reading at home. The highlighted section, starting with faith. Can you see it? Michael is really peering there. Michael, is it big enough?
Yes, it's just focused.
I got it. Okay. Like many other thinkers, Steinberg, so the indented stuff is Steinberg's word, the outdented stuff is the editor, Sonsino. Like many other thinkers, Steinberg starts with the idea that human knowledge about God is necessarily limited by our own human shortcomings. Steinberg, we cannot know God completely. At the essence of God, what God is in God's self, we can only guess. And of God's manifestations or works we comprehend only that shred which our senses can grasp and our mind conceive. Rambam would totally agree with that sentence, right? He would just say, oh, you just repeated what I said. We can't really know. God is fundamentally anything, unlike anything in our world. We can't really understand anything about God. We see manifestations, apparent manifestations of God in our world, which we call things like God's love, God's anger, God's mighty outstretched arm, God's nostrils flaring, and all that's just kind of our human language to try to interpret what we can apprehend of God. But we don't know anything about the essence of God. Okay? Rambam. Steinberg argues that we must accept the existence of God on faith alone. Logic by itself cannot bring us to the belief in God. Steinberg, for like all other propositions, that of the existence of God is not completely provable. It remains the conclusion of an act of faith. Okay? And this is where he would disagree, let us say, with Spinoza, right? Spinoza would say, I only believe in that which is provable, and this is not provable, and therefore it is not factually accurate. And Steinberg says, yes, correct. It's an act of faith to have this belief. By the way, we talked about this a number of times in the person who was who were very explicit about this were both Rav Soloveitchik and Rabbi Heschel. This is their faith. It is not provable. However, Steinberg says, a religious interpretation of reality, argues Steinberg, makes more sense. It's not provable, but it's sensible. It may not be as certain as a scientific theory, but for that matter, even science is based on certain assumptions that are taken for granted. Right. I've been reading some science stuff lately to try to figure out how it maps onto Kabbalah in my own mind. And there are a lot of things in particle physics about, they say, well, we're not sure. Could be. We haven't gotten that deep yet, right? So we know now. I'm not anti-science, okay? I believe you should get your vaccinations. But we know now that scientific theories are theories, and we hope that in 100 years there will be better theories. That's the nature of science. So he's saying, even science isn't fact. It keeps, the hypotheses keep changing, right? So he's saying, don't think that there's a distinction between fact, i.e. science, and faith. Even science changes, and my interpretation that God exists is based on faith, but it makes sense. How does it make sense? And you may agree or disagree with the following paragraph at the top of page 1. Here before me unfolds a universe which is dynamic, creative, and rational in the sense that everything in it conforms to the law of its own being. A world that has produced in living things what seems to be purposiveness, and in humanity the phenomenon of consciousness. No other theory except that which posits a thought will, capitalized T and capitalized W, as the essence of things, fits such a scene. This is his reasonableness. I look at the world the way it is and how we human beings have evolved, and in my mind, the most reasonable explanation is that there is a God that is behind that. And I think he would understand that you might think that the most reasonable explanation is that there's no God behind that. It's just molecules colliding. He says, nope, I don't think that. We end up with consciousness, and he'd say also morality and ideas about good and evil. I don't think molecules colliding is the best explanation for that. I think that there's a thought will behind it, which is called God, is the most likely explanation for it. That's an act of faith. I think he would say that. He just says, he says, a religious, or this is what the editor says, a religious interpretation of reality makes more sense. This is what makes sense. By the way, this is an aside. I've said this in this class before, but not for a long. I had a discussion with a Cantor colleague in Livingston, New Jersey, 40, in which we concluded the following, and I don't think I've really changed it in 40 years. Okay. The idea that there is a supernatural being behind the universe who created everything that we see and acted through natural selection and DNA to end up with babies being born is incredibly far-fetched. The idea that there's no intelligent being behind that, and it all comes from molecules colliding dumbly, D-U-M-B-L-Y, without any plan that eventually yields in DNA and a baby being born, is far-fetched. Whether you're a believer or not comes down to which of those two far-fetched propositions you think is slightly more or less far-fetched than the other. They're both really far-fetched. Okay. If you're a poetic-minded person, you might call them both amazing. Okay. If you're a totally scientific, non-supernaturalist person, you'd say, well, I don't know. Molecules collide. It's a lot of molecules. It's an incredible complexity of zillions of electrons over billions of years. And that's what you end up with is a baby, crying its first cry. And supernaturalists would say, no, it's because there's got to be something behind that drove that directionally, a force. By the way, we'll see some of these limited theists who say, yeah, you can call it a force if you want. The traditional word is God. You don't like the word God, you can call it force. You can call it being, right? They always capitalize it so that they know that you're meaning it as a substitute for God. You can call it thought will, right? Maimonides called it what we translate into English as intellect, although the word that we translate into English as intellect, sechel, right? Or muskal. He wouldn't use muskal because it's passive sechel, right? Sechel Elohi, divine intellect. By the way, I think contemporary people, because intellect implies like you're intellectual and you don't feel things, you're not an artist, you're an intellectual. So I think contemporary people would probably want to translate that word more as maybe consciousness, maybe. Okay. Steinberg's understanding of God. Steinberg does not provide us with a short definition of what he means by God, though he views God in theistic terms. Quoting, okay, slow down. Gotta slow down. The entire universe, as I see it, is the outward manifestation of mind energy. That sounds like Rambam, except Rambam would just say mind, right? Mind energy. Steinberg is 20th century, so he adds energy, okay? Mind energy of spirit, or to use the older and better word, of God. God is then the essential being of all things, though all beings in their totality do not exhaust God. That's interesting, right? Is he just a modern rationalist using other words for panentheism? God is in all things, like the Kabbalah, divinity flows into everything. He says, well, God is the essential being of all beings. By the way, that Hebrew word for being would be Havaya. We'll get to neo-Hasidic thinkers who use the word Havaya, which is a Kabbalistic term, which translates as being or beingness, right? The name Yud, He, and Vav, He, God's deepest name, is a cipher or an epithet for beingness, Havaya. Okay, but he's saying, but all beings do not fully, meaning there could be some part of God that is outside of all existing beings in their totality. Maybe he's a closet Maimonidean. There's something outside of beingness that is God. So Steinberg maintains that God is not only a power, but also a mind akin to our own. Because God is a mind, God is purposive and ethical, which means there's teleology or direction or purpose, and there's morality. God enters into relations with the created world and primarily with humankind. Okay, here's the but. We're about to get to the punchline of what makes him a limited theist. Yet Steinberg readily admits God is not all powerful. Steinberg comes to this conclusion in order to allow human freedom on the one hand and the presence of evil on the other. God is absolute in the sense of being a creator, to whom we stand as creatures. This is where he would disagree with Kaplan. He is not a non-supernaturalist. He is a supernaturalist. Creator to whom we stand as creatures. That's the one half. But the other half, while being at the same time a self-limiting power. I wrote in the margin, Tzimtzum, right? None of these semi-limited theists, that the three of them we're talking about, none of them were into Kabbalah in any overt kind of way. People didn't study Kabbalah back then, at Jewish Theological Seminary in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. Kushner is a bit of a Kabbalist to me. Read some Kabbalah. Okay, but God chooses to self-limit. God is a power, capital P, but self-limiting. I'll read. To the extent of the reality of our freedom, God is limited in God's power. If humanity is to have real freedom, God's control cannot be complete. Maimonides talks about this, right? In Pirkei Avot, it says, Hakol tzafui v'harashut nituna. Rashut, not rashut, rashut nituna. God foresees everything, yet you have free will, right? And this is a fellow that says that in Pirkei Avot. It's a rabbinic statement, okay? And the medieval philosophers say, well, that's a conundrum, because if God foresees what I'm going to choose, God is omniscient, then I don't have free will. God knows what I'm going to do, which means it's foretold in air quotes, but only to God. And so I don't have free will. And this is their, circle they need to square. And they, my mind says, no, both are true, right? You have free will, and because God is omniscient, God knows, by the way, now all the neuroscience people tell us, you don't have free will, right? It's just, thousands, millions of tumblers of your cells, that sum up and say, I'm going to reach for that apple and eat it, take a bite because I'm hungry. It's not a choice in air quotes. It's just the result of your molecules. Everyone follow what I'm saying, I assume. I'm saying that in shorthand, but you get it. Lots of articles and books nowadays about what is consciousness. It's just cells and chemicals. Okay. So,
No, I would like to.
whereas up, you have to mute yourself, Terry. So the neuroscientists say it's not free choice. It's just determined by how the molecules go. The philosophers say, well, it is free choice, but God is omniscient and knows everything. Okay? And he's avoiding the question here of if God is omniscient or not, but he is saying, and this is contra Maimonides, he's saying God is not omnipotent, all-powerful, but God chooses to be omnipotent. God chooses to not be omnipotent. God is self-limiting, okay? Self-limiting. But then, in my mind, there's a little control. God's control cannot be complete, which I think he means God can't choose to exert complete control. I think we're going to stop with the next paragraph. The belief in the all-powerful nature of God creates a major problem for Steinberg. He clearly states, God is indubitably the power of rationality, of design, of order, of meaningfulness, of creativity, Rambam, all that, great. Yet traditional conceptions of God are somehow inadequate to deal with the problem of evil. We're going to stop here. We're going to go on to this next week. So, remember I said that, any theology's got to answer, I think I called them the 4 big questions. Why am I here and what am I supposed to do? You could say those are 2 questions, but I'll call them 1. Why am I here and what am I supposed to do? What's out there? Why is there evil and suffering in the world? And what happens when I die? Okay? Any theology or philosophy's got to address the 4 big questions of human existence. Okay? This class is not a class on how we explain evil in Jewish theology. It's on the nature of God in Jewish theology and how it pertains to the Siddur. But just to mention here, in traditional Jewish theology, there are well-developed theories of why is there evil and suffering. In the Bible, it's because it's a punishment that God gave you. Then the rabbis developed a theory. The rabbis kind of read Job, and they developed a theory about, well, there's another world beyond this world. So, the rich may prosper, but that's only temporary. It's in this world. They're going to get their comeuppance in a future world. And the poor may suffer, the righteous may suffer, but that's just temporary because they'll get their reward in the future world. And they say, in Pirkei Avot, this is just the anteroom, or what we used to call in Queens, the front hall. We had a room called the front hall. Had a coat room, and you stamp your feet to get the water off your shoes, and then you walk into the house, right? And it says Pirkei Avot says, this world that we live in is just the front hall of the palace. The palace is life eternal after this life, right? So the sages of the Mishnah and Talmud developed that theory. Some people say under the influence of Greek thought, right? That there's an idea and an abstract beyond the concrete. Let's put it that way. That's what makes it Greek thought. An abstract beyond the concrete. What we see and live is only the concrete. But there's an abstract beyond this, and that's, by the way, I think in the Kabbalah Center, they call it the 1% reality and the 99% reality, right? What we are living through is just the 1% reality. There's a 99% reality out there. Okay, so that's how the sages deal with the problem of evil. Don't worry, you'll get your reward. Don't worry, they'll get their punishment in the world to come. However, from the reward and punishment, the biblical idea, we are still not uninfluenced by it, right? So why was the first temple destroyed? Because of the sin of idolatry. That's why God allowed it to happen as a punishment to us. Why was the second temple destroyed? Because of baseless hatred. Okay? If you follow that line through, and I know that a lot of people find this to be an obscenity, a lot of modern people find this to be an obscenity, so I'm giving a Holocaust trigger warning. Why was there a Shoah, right? And the traditional Haredi answer is because the Jews of Eastern Europe were becoming less religious, and God allowed there to be a punishment, right? Just consistency-wise, right? Consistency-wise. There's no conceptual difference between God chose to allow the Babylonians to conquer Israel and destroy the temple as a punishment. That's what it says in the prophets, okay? God chose to allow the Romans to destroy the Second Commonwealth and burn the temple again as a punishment. God chose to allow the Nazis and their helpers to perpetrate the Holocaust. There's no logical difference among those three. We, most of us on this Zoom, are horrified by the third statement because that's not our theology. But it's no different logically than saying the first destruction of the temple happened because of the sin of idolatry. No difference. Okay. So here's where we have to stop, but we're going to continue with Steinberg next week. So what our editor is telling us is because Steinberg rejects certain traditional ideas about God intervening in history, because he's a limited theist, because he says God chooses to not intervene. And here's where he's different, by the way, than Yitz Greenberg. Yitz Greenberg says God used to intervene, but now chooses not to. Steinberg is more consistent. He would say, no. Part of the human condition is that God has always chosen not to intervene. Okay? So that leaves him with two problems. One is, how do you understand the description of the nature of miracles, which we're not going to talk about, all right? But the other, which we are going to talk about next week, God willing, is, but then how do you explain evil, all right? If God is all-powerful but chooses not to intervene, you've got to give me some explanation about why God allows innocent people to suffer. I want to say, which he's going to try to do. I want to say one more thing about the problem of evil. Again, this class is our 3-year class is not about that. Okay, but here we're just going to we're going to strike a glancing blow, as it were. Talk about that just a little bit. I just want to headline this, foreshadow, to say when theologians talk about why is there evil in the world, they sometimes mix together two different things, which there are some thinkers who say we actually really need to separate those two things. Okay? Evil can mean human suffering. Why does a child die horribly of cancer before their time? That's suffering. Okay? And people doing evil to each other. Why does a child die in a gas chamber? Or, oh man, I'm going to get into a level, so I'm going to avoid trouble. I'll just say, freezing to death and malnourished in a tent, but I won't say where, okay, because I don't want to get into trouble. So caused by human suffering, or caused by human cruelty, right? Active cruelty or passive cruelty, right? So when we talk about the nature of evil, we talk about why humans have it bad when they shouldn't have it bad. There's really two parts. There's sickness and death, which we'll call suffering caused by, let's call it nature, in air quotes, right? Cancer cells, part of nature. Cells divide. Sometimes they divide abnormally, So we now understand, right? Ancient people didn't understand why someone got cancer or how someone got cancer. Now we understand that. Now we understand that the child died because there was pneumonia, because there was bacteria that spread through their body. If they didn't get antibiotics in time, that's why they died. We understand a lot more about that. Kushner, the third one we're going to study, talks about that a lot, because he's going to say, when people say why, and Kushner had a child who died, right? When people say, why did that child die? They don't really mean, explain to me about cancer cells. What they really mean is, why did this happen to my child? What's the reason that this happened to me? They're not really asking for a mechanical explanation. They're asking for a moral explanation, a meaning explanation. What's the meaning of this, that this awful thing happened? Okay, so we'll talk about that more when we get to Kushner. But I just want to point out, very often the problem of evil is really subdivided into two things. I'll call it natural suffering, sickness and death, versus human-caused suffering, which is cruelty. Okay? And you really have to look at them two different ways, because if you're a deist, if you're a watchmaker guy, or gal, you'd say, God wound up the watch, and I'm sorry, bacteria happen and cancer cells happened, and that just happens. It's not because God made it happen. Apollo didn't shoot his arrows and send the pestilence to someone. It just happens because that's the way the system is set up. So sickness and death happens. The sickness and death wing of evil happens because that's just the way God set up the universe. Okay? Human cruelty, that might be a different story. That might be about morality, right? Someone got pneumonia and died is not about morality. Unless the morality part is, they live in a part of the world that doesn't get antibiotics because the developing world does not sell its pharmaceutical products at prices that the people there can afford, and that's a moral issue. And that's, by the way, then where the sickness and death wing of evil intersects with the human choice wing of evil. Does that make sense? Everyone get that? I said a lot of things all together. Okay, but very often, if you read in the Talmud, why is there evil? Evil is seen as both the rabbi dying a painful death from a natural illness and the Romans torturing people. Both of those things are seen as evil. And I think later thinkers who understand the world, and this emerges obviously from a more scientific materialist understanding of how certain things in the world work, later thinkers would say, no, those are not both evil. They're different things. Let's call one suffering. Let's call the other one evil, with a capital E. Okay, said a lot there. So we're going to continue with Steinberg next week, because I do want to be consistent, just finish up his thought about, okay, so how do I explain evil? Okay, because really all these people, Schulweis does it, Kushner does it, have to explain, okay, so if there's a God out there, and if you're a traditionalist, then you know why there's evil, because God sends rewards and punishments. But if you're a limited theist, and you say there's a God out there, but God chooses not to intervene, then you have to explain why God allows there to be suffering in the world, if God could choose to prevent that. Everyone follow the line of why it's a question, why it's a dilemma, okay? And again, this is where Chazal, the sages of the Talmud, were great. They made it all consistent. They said, no, not a problem. That child will go to the world, that innocent child will go to Olam Haba, the world to come. That's the real palace. That's the main event. This world is, they would agree with Thomas Hobbes, this world is nasty, brutish, and short. But it's only 1% of reality. Okay. Woof. I don't know, man. Heavy. All right. Stay healthy. Be Torah. See you next week.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tba.org. la.org.